This episode is in partnership with Authority Magazine. Authority Magazine, a Medium publication, is devoted to sharing in-depth and interesting interviews featuring people who are authorities in business, pop culture, wellness, social impact, and tech. Today's guest on Believe in People, I'm a little envious of, basically because he's lived and done it all.
He is Robert Ward, journalist, author, and television writer for the hit series Hill Street Blues.
And today we have the privilege of tapping into his world of creativity. Bob, welcome to Believe in People. Well, you've had one heck of a journey. Why don't we just start off by having you give us a little thumbnail tale of your journey as a writer, journalist, television guru, the whole deal. How did you get into it?
Well, as a kid, I read the first book I ever read. I mean, like a real book besides Dick and Jane, was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Ah.
And it was so exciting. I loved it. I just thought it was fantastic. And I announced to my parents, I guess I was 4 or 5. I said, I am going to write books when I grow up. That's what I said.
Wow.
And my mother thought it was cute. You know, she said, oh, that's cute. And I got furious. I said, no. Are you laughing at me? Because I am going to write books. And she said, oh, well, excuse me. And winked at my father. And they were still, what's the word? I can't think of it. You know, when people talk down to you.
Condescending.
They were, and I didn't know the word then, and now I don't know it again. But anyway,
I don't know now.
I was being condescended to. In a big way. And it really irritated me. And I was like, because I am going to write books. There's no question. I started writing right after that stories. And they were really terrible, but they were sort of stories with little morals in them, you know, which is the kind of stories that I think I read in Vacation Bible School. Now there's a memory.
You went to Vacation Bible School? Those two words in the same sentence?
Well, they sent me to it. You know what the weirdest thing was? I went to Vacation Bible School and we were singing Jesus Loves Me, Yes I Know, because the Bible tells me so. And I like to sing, so I sang along. And I happened to be reading a book they had sitting there of great paintings. Then I looked at it, and it was a war between two factions, and they were cutting each other's heads off and holding the heads up, you know, and the blood coming out, all the vocal cords hanging out, and people just slaughtering each other, and women and
Mad
children.
Magazine. That was Mad Magazine.
Well, I was soon a subscriber to Mad Magazine. I can tell you that. I loved Mad Magazine, and I would get it. I would take it into my bedroom and hide it under the covers and read it with a flashlight. And then I would get hysterical laughing, and my father would hear me and say, "What's going on in there?" And I'd say, "Oh, nothing. I'm sleeping. I'm trying to." You know, he'd come in and rip off the cover and say, "You and that Mad Magazine, you know, take that and put it away." And I'd say, "But it's really funny." And then he'd say, "Yeah, but it's 10:30." Anyway, that was the beginning. I think Mad Magazine tortured all of us in our generation to not trust anything. The other thing I was thinking about was Howdy Doody. Do you remember Howdy Doody?
Oh yeah.
It's Howdy Doody time. It's Howdy Doody time. But I was thinking about that show. Howdy Doody was like a nice kid who looked sort of like he was kind of ugly actually, but he had on cowboy outfits.
Yeah.
And since we all were cowboys in those days, and then he had this guy, Mr. Bluster, was the evil Mr. Bluster, and he was a flat out capitalist. He was sort of like Trump. And that's all he cared about was money, 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 money. And Howdy Doody always owed him money and he couldn't pay him. And then he would get Buffalo Bob to trick Mr. Bluster, and Mr. Bluster would end up losing every episode. And I thought that was probably the first left-wing children's show that was probably written by old lefties. And who were, called in by the House Un-American Activities Committee, something I didn't know about that yet, but pretty soon found out about. And it was just an amazing show because it made everybody have sympathy for the poor and not for Mr. Blusters of the world. And here's the funny part now is that the poor themselves now worship Donald Trump, who is Mr. Bluster, and pretends he's going to help them when he gets in as president. And he didn't help them last time, and he won't help them this time. He'll just help his rich friends. And they still believe it. They don't care what he says. They say he says anything, and they go, yeah, right. Give me a MAGA hat.
Yeah.
These people
Hey, Bob, quick question. So, okay, at 4, I can't believe at 4 you wanted to become a writer, and you were determined to become a journalist like Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson. Why them, and why them?
Well, first of all, I didn't like to read most political columns. Tom Wolfe has written about this, and he was totally right. Most political columns were so boring. The writing was so dull that it was almost, you'd start to read it. I would really try to read them, like in the Baltimore Sun. And about halfway through the column, I fall asleep. It was like, wow, that was like perfect sleeping pill, man. It was just great. It was so freaking boring. And then Tom Wolfe came along with this incredible style that had, just one great line in it after another. It was funny. It was charming. And he kept himself in the story too. And so when he did that great book on Ken Kesey, what was it called? The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. I mean, I read that in it was a huge book, like 400 pages. I read that in about 5 hours. I loved every minute of it. Wow. And I loved all his novels. I loved all his essays and stuff that he did in that what's a Candy Flake Baby. I loved all that stuff. And I thought, okay. And then I read Hunter Thompson, and I felt the same way. These guys you could read, and they weren't pretending to be, omniscient or any of that stuff. And they didn't pretend to keep themselves out of it, because anybody who writes anything is in it, even if they are incredibly boring. We knew who the left-wing columnists were and the right-wing columnists were. And this idea that they were going to be, objective was a joke. So as soon as I realized these guys were really writing the new novels of the day, I mean, most novels had become boring. The novels I liked growing up were the novels of I did like Steinbeck. He was my favorite. Yeah. I loved his books. But I really liked Norman Mailer, James Baldwin, and the novelists and essayists of that generation, Styron. I liked all that stuff. And those guys were really exciting. And then even more exciting to me were the new journalists that came after them. And it was, my life was really interesting in the sense that I got, what did I do? I went to Towson College, this little school across the street from my house. I wasn't going to go to college because both my parents only went to high school. My father later went to 2 years of Johns Hopkins night school and got straight A's. He was a brilliant guy. But he ended up in computers. Which is funny. I'll explain why in a minute. But he ended up in computers and ended up putting in UNIVAC in Social Security. And that was like, you remember UNIVAC? It was this giant computer that took up 3 different rooms.
Yeah.
And now your phone has more power than that whole computer does. So it's shows how far we've come, or gone, or down, or up. I can't remember which. But anyway, so I got through Towson. I wasn't going to go to college, but my parents happened to move across the street from Towson, literally across the street from it. In fact, when you looked out on my front porch, you looked at our little street, then you looked at their little access road, then you had the campus that was all like 8 feet away, and then you had the girls' dormitory. I would look out at the girls' dormitory and see all these naked women walking about, and I thought, wow, man. I was going to go work. Yeah, I was going to go work. Are you kidding? I'm going to college. So
Wait a minute.
I walked,
Are you John Belushi?
it sort of felt that way, you know. I walked across the campus, and then I went up past the student union and up to the office building, and I said, "Hey, I'd like to come to this college." And they said, "What? Have you sent us your grades from high school yet?" And I thought, "Uh-oh," because I didn't even go to college, high school hardly. I mean, when I pretended to go to high school, we used to go play poker every day. And somehow I got through high school. So I got A's in English and D's and C's and almost everything else because I didn't come to class very often. The teachers liked me though. They said, you're smart. Why do you act like this?"
Huh.
And I thought, that's a good question. I really don't know. I was confused. My my mother and father were having horrible fights every day. I didn't like to go home. And it was just ugly around there. You know, they started out well, they seemed to be happy, but then things rapidly went downhill. So I just didn't hang out very much. My father had he had OCD. You know what that is, right? Obsessive compulsive disorder. And he washed himself night and day. That's in my first novel, Shedding Skin. I mean, everything that happened to me as a kid, like all this sort of, things that happen to every kid, like I'm having my first date. I yelled through a bathroom door and I could hear him in the shower. You hear this shower going on. You hear this, yeah, it's great, son. First date. That's great. Did you take the soap? I say, oh, shit. So I hit a home run today. Yeah, it's good. It was after a while, I stopped telling him about it. I just whatever happened, and I didn't bother to tell him or my mother because I wasn't there very often.
Hey, Robert, what happened? So when did you move in with your grandparents, your grandmother?
I would go over there and live with my grandmother. That's right. My grandmother lived near the high school. So I would get on my bike, I'd take some clothes and get on my bike, and I would just show up at her house. And she was like the world's most wonderful person, Gracie Weaver, her name was. And she was a 8th grade person who played Mozart and who read Thomas Mann. And if she'd had any education, she would have been somebody like Eleanor Roosevelt because she was totally for progressive causes.
Yeah.
And she was just this total brilliant person.
Yeah.
Like my father, but much more out there,
Yeah.
And she was married to a sea captain who was like somebody like Wallace Berry in 1930s movies. He was like this roiling, tough guy. And he was small like Jimmy Cagney, and he moved like Jimmy Cagney, but he was scary as shit because he was tough. So one day, for example, because she was a progressive cause, so she had all the black people from Morgan College come to the house on Sunday. Now, this is in a white redneck neighborhood, and she had them come to talk about non-violent demonstrations at Hutzler's department store, downtown Baltimore, because they wouldn't hire black people. This is in the 50s. So I was living with her at the time, and all these people came in their Sunday best, was right after church, and they came and they looked out at this street of white people all out on the porch staring at them. The white people were in shock. The black people were very cool. They came in, they said, hello, son, you know what I mean? And I nodded to them. Now, I was thrilled by all this because I like black people. In fact, I wasn't even quite aware they were black people. I just liked them because I had a couple of black friends and we just played together. It never occurred to me they were any different than me. It was weird. And until I heard somebody call them Negroes, I didn't even know what they were called. I just thought, this is great. These are cool people. I didn't even notice, I don't think I even really noticed their physical differences from me. I know that sounds goofy, but I remember playing with them and not thinking about anything like that. So anyway,
but Bob, did you get your activism from your grandmother then? Do you think that was part of it? Yeah, I thought, yeah.
Oh, totally. So then she says, she's in there and I can hear them talking about their strategy, and I'm out on the front porch. Now this kid Butchie comes down the front, right in front of the house, stands in the middle of the street with all the white people watching on the street. And he starts yelling, Bobby Ward, you fag, this and that, and all that crap. And I didn't let him get to me finally said, Grace Ward is a nigger lover and all those niggers stink, you know. And I said, you shouldn't have said that. And I ran from the porch down. She had a steps and then she had a hill. So I ran down the steps. I'm just amazing I didn't fall. And then down the hill instead of down the other steps and ran. By that time, I picked up serious amount of steam and ran right into him, smashed him on the ground. And I'd always been afraid of this kid. But suddenly I found myself on top of him.
Huh.
And he was screaming, "Oh, get off me." Oh, and suddenly he was not so brave anymore. So I grabbed him by the ears and started picking his head up and down, smashing it on the cement, saying, "How do you feel now, Butch? You want to say something else about my grandmother?" And I was beating the shit out of him, to put it mildly. And then I felt this hand grab my shoulder. And I looked down, and there was a brown hand. And I turned around. It was this very good-looking black guy. And he said, "No, son, this is not the way."
Huh.
And then I remembered, oh, my God, they're discussing nonviolence, and here I am beating the shit out of this guy. This is not the way. It's definitely. So I began to cry. I was like, "I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. Oh, my God." You know, I felt such embarrassment for my grandmother and such hatred of myself for doing it. And she looked at me with such sternness. She said, "You go upstairs and clean yourself off. And don't come out of the bathroom till this meeting is over." So I went upstairs. I was crying to myself. Oh, my God, my grandmother hates me now. Here she was doing nonviolence, and I'm beating the hell out of somebody. And so I got myself all cleaned up, and she came into the bathroom. And she said, "What on earth got into you?" I said, "I don't know. He was saying horrible things about both black people and you, and I couldn't stand any more of it." And he said, "Well, you've got to stand it because you could have started a race ride. Do you realize that?" And I said, "Yeah, I know. All those black people would have been killed by all those white people if they come down off the porch." None of them did, by the way. I think they were they were in shock about what happened to Butchie. So she looked at me after all this and she hugged me and she said, "But you really got him good, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I did." And she said, "I know. That was great." And then she said, "But we're never going to talk about it again."
Wow.
So she really deeply appreciated it.
You know,
And
when you moved on in your career, I want to talk specifically about the fact that you wrote several episodes for Hill Street Blues. I mean, that was a very socially conscious television show for its time. As a matter of fact, it was. I mean, it obviously was the most popular television show at its time. It came, on the heels of All in the Family and these sorts of shows, but that show really addressed these sorts of inner city struggles between the haves and the have-nots, people who look different from one another. Do you think these life experiences played a role in the scripts that you wrote for Hill Street Blues?
Oh, definitely. Well, the first one I ever wrote for them. If you want to talk about believing in people, here's a good story that will make you believe in people, even if you don't believe in them. So I'm a friend of mine, Roger Director, who had worked on Hill Street and had moved over to Moonlighting. He said, "Look, if you're going to work on Hill Street," well, first of all, my agent, Esther Newberg, said, "What are you going to do after you finish Red Baker?" And I should tell you about Red Baker. My book about steel workers in Baltimore who were broke and out of luck and didn't have any money, and the steel mills were closing. And that's what my book Red Baker is about. It took me 6 years to write it. It was torture. It was torture. I mean, I started out writing another book called Baltimore, which was going to be this unbelievable giant book about all and everything in Baltimore. Well, of course, it was way too big and the stuff didn't work. And I kept at it because I never give up. But keeping at something that's not working can finally just kill you. So I thought, I don't know what to do. And I was wandering around the village one night. I lived in New York in the village. And I was wandering up from Soho and I had a couple of drinks and I was just feeling deeply depressed. My other book was going nowhere. And I went up to my room little pad I had there in Barrow and Hudson. And I went to bed. I was feeling that slimy feeling you get if you drunk too much and you don't even feel like changing your clothes. I was lying there in my underwear, half going to sleep. And suddenly this voice came into my head. It said, I am Red Baker. And the voice and the story I'm about to tell you is about my wife and family and my kids and how I almost lost them forever. And I thought, what is this? This had nothing to do with the other book, but it was in Baltimore. So I ran to the next room where I had my typewriter. This is pre-computer. And I started writing like crazy. And I wrote for 6 hours, and I had 42 pages of it by the time it was over. And all the characters were there. It was Red and his wife Wanda and their son Ace and Vinnie Toriano, who owned this bar. Now, I'd hung out down there thinking that would be part of this other book, that area. But I didn't really want to write about the wealthy and all that. I mean, what are their problems compared to these people's problems? And so I didn't find that very dramatic or interesting. Besides, they already had 1 million people writing about it. Like everybody could go read John Cheever if they want to read about those people. So I was stunned that this thing came out like it did. I didn't have to make up any characters or anything. It all just came out. So I thought, well, hell, I'm just going to keep writing. And I wrote the whole book in about 3 months.
Wow.
Well, it needed work, but because I had made too many jokes in it. The truth was it was such a dark book, and I was afraid it would be too dark. So I tried to put jokes in it. I tried to have Red make jokes and stuff. Well, that didn't work. It had to go all the way to the dark or it wouldn't be real. So I got it done. And I gave it to my agent. He said, this is an American masterpiece. We'll sell this for a lot of money. And I said, just sell it for any money. Because I haven't had a book out in a long time. And I really, this was right. And I knew it was right. So he sent it out to 32 book publishers in one day. And they all turned it down. And needless to say, I was suicidal at that point. I was, he called me up and I said, well, how'd the auction go? He said, well, Wardo, he always called me Wardo. Well, Wardo, nobody bid. I said, nobody bid. That's impossible. Nobody bid? He said, nope. He said, I had a lot of calls, though. Good people. President of Simon & Schuster called and said he cried when he read it. So moving. I said, and he didn't bid? He said, no, he said that it was a book about working class people, and working class people don't read books. And middle class people won't read books about working class people. Wow. So who's going to buy it? And I hadn't thought of any of that because I didn't think about who would buy it. I just thought, well, everybody read Steinbeck in the day, but that was back in the 30s, I guess. Nobody cared anymore. So I was like, I was going out with my girlfriend at the time. She was like the producer of All Things Considered, Celeste Wesson, who I ended up marrying, and we've been married for 45 years now. So anyway, I called her down in Washington. We were having this back and forth horrible relationship where you had to go see each other. I hate those kinds of relationships. But anyway, I took a train down there. I just went to her little place in Glover Park, and I just went to bed. I went to bed for like 3 days. And at the end of the third day, I woke up thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I don't think I can write anymore. It's too brutal. So finally, this woman, Joyce Johnson, this wonderful woman who's herself kind of a great character. I mean, she's a great character from literary history. She was Jack Kerouac's girlfriend.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. And she wrote wonderful things in a book called Minor Characters. Minor characters meaning the women in the beatniks, which you never hear about or who you never hear about. So anyway, she called me, and she was now an editor at Dial Press, which was James Baldwin's press. And I'd become friends with James Baldwin, and he was like so nice to me. He was such a wonderful person. He believed in me and my talent. He believed in his book, but he couldn't get it published. So Joyce Johnson called me and said, Bobby, we're going to publish this book, but I can only give you $10,000 for it. I said, are you kidding? I'm thrilled. $10,000 is wonderful. I'll take it. And she said, I just want you to know one thing. Jack Kerouac would have loved this book. And I said, you know what? That makes up for the entire amount of put downs that I've had on this book. 32 of them in one day. Just hearing that makes me feel hope again.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I'm glad it did, because Jack really would have loved it. And I thought, wow.
That's something. And you know what? We're definitely going to do a part 2 on this, Bob, because you have so many incredible stories. But before, I want to ask you, who's the one of the most interesting people you've ever met?
Well, I always say Jimmy Baldwin, James Baldwin, Jimmy, we all called him Jimmy. He's one of the best people I ever met, because first of all, if you've ever read James Baldwin's essays, they are some of the greatest essays ever written by any American, not just any Black American, any American. And his perspective on race and all the things that happened in the 60s is beyond belief brilliant. And he was such a great guy because he was completely without any snobbery. He knew how good he was, yeah, but he was a great person.
Wow.
And he was nice. He was nice to everybody. Do I have time for one last story about him?
Yes.
Of course.
All right. So this is a great story. When I met Celeste, I met her at a party in New York. It seems like everything was about politics then. And I went to this political party of lefties that up in it was a commune of women, and they had a commune up on West End Avenue around 79th Street. This other woman asked me to come, and I said, all right, I'll come. And another woman I knew had come up to visit me from Baltimore, and she was just a friend, and she came with me, and we were, people were dancing and having fun, and we went out to the kitchen, and this beautiful blonde walked in with these beautiful Lauren Bacall type eyes, and she looked at me.
That's Celeste, Kevin.
Yeah, that's Celeste, and she said, "Hi," and I was like, "Nah." I felt like Ralph Cramden or somebody, you know what I mean? Like, I'm gonna. And she then started announcing. She said, "The reason I have to have everybody here is I have to announce that 3 Mile Island is melting down as we speak, and they're talking about the winds changing and coming right across and hitting us, And I was like, what?" And everybody was like, "Oh shit!" But here's how sick I was. I just looked at her and thought, well, if it's the end of the world, I'll never get a chance to sleep with her. And that's really going to be stinks, man. I hate that. I was leaving, and Elaine, my friend from Baltimore, said, "Did you have a good time?" And I said, "Well, yeah, except I met that one girl, the one who told us we were all going to die." And I said, "The trouble is, I know I'm going to marry her, and I don't want to call her back because I don't want to be married again. I've been married twice already. My second marriage was a spectacular flop." And she said, "Marry her? You hardly even know her, Ward. You're crazy." And I said, "I know, but I know I'm going to marry her, so let's not talk about it." It happened. And here's how it happened. The first date I took her out, she came down I was living down in the village, and she was living up there. She came down to the village. I said, "I'll take you to a really good place I know in the village." So I took her to this very cool Indian restaurant. And it was on the side of like the west side, all the way to the west side, almost to 14th Street. It was a really cool place. I go in there. They have this little service bar in the front, those little service bars that like these places have, like three seats. There's this only guy in there. I look at the back of his head. I know who it is immediately. I said, "Jimmy." And he turned around and said, "Bobby." It was Baldwin. And we started hugging. Yeah, we started hugging each other. And she looked at when she looked at me, she said, "You know James Baldwin." She was gonna she was gonna faint. I think that got me a lot of points,
That's a great story. That's a great story.
Our first date. So
wow.
I think from there things went pretty smoothly.
Well, you have a lot to thank him for.
Oh, yeah, I do. I have a lot to thank him for. He was a wonderful, wonderful person. And plus, when I think that I read his essays back when I was in college and even in high school,
yeah,
hear what became this good personal friend of mine. It was a dream come true in a way. And I met everybody practically I met Mail, we never became friends, actually. He was such a belligerent character. He was funny, though. I told him I was partially became a writer because of him, Norman Mailer. And he said, "Yeah, well, if you became a writer because of me, kid, you better be good because I don't want any hacks imitating me." I said, "I'm good. I'm good." He was, and I had a lot of great friends. Saul York was a wonderful radical novelist. I don't know if you remember him, but he wrote a wonderful book you could still read called The Bag, about the things that happened in the 60s. It's probably the best book ever written about the 60s.
Wow.
And all these people were friends to me. I came there, I was nobody, and they befriended me. They helped me. They read my work. Tom Wolfe read my work when I was still teaching in upstate New York at Hobart and wanted to come down and be a journalist like Tom Wolfe. He came to he read a good part of my novel, Shedding Skin. The first, he said, "You're really a terrific writer. What are you doing living here? He said, are you a monk or something?" He was extremely funny. And I said, "I can't get out of here. I don't have any money. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'll make it in New York." He said, "Make it. You're going to be a big star there. You should move there immediately and quit this stuff." So I did. I just said, if Tom Wolfe believes in me, what more does it take? I moved and I went to New York, and pretty soon I was one of the top journalists in magazines. My name was on the cover of magazine after magazine, and it was like happened immediately because I totally loved doing it. I loved going out. I loved interviewing people. I loved to have the chase, and could you get great stuff? And if you couldn't get great stuff, you couldn't pay the rent, so you really tried hard to pay it, because I didn't have any money. And I tell you, those pieces, they're all in one magazine. They're all in one book now called Renegades.
Oh, Renegades. Yes.
Yeah, it has all my best pieces in it. And I'm telling you, they are very entertaining and good, I think, because I worked really hard to make them that way. And the Library Journal said, that it was a book that if you wanted to know anything about the new journalism, you had to read this book. So I was thrilled I got those kind of reviews and the same kind of mentions that Hunter and Tom got. So it was great. And that led me into writing Red Baker. And Red Baker got me a gig on Hill Street. And I'll tell you about that another time, because that is a story in itself that's beyond belief. It's like the most incredible, mind-boggling story of how that happened. It almost makes you believe in mysticism or something. Because
Kev, that's a hook. That's a hook. I hear a hook.
Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, you got to go. So it's a mind-boggling story.
Well, tell us before you do go, just because you've shared so many stories about how the people around you befriended you, pushed you along, cajoled you, why do you believe in people?
Well, it's easy not to believe in people because the world's so filled with violence. I mean, Israel is gone. I mean, yeah, I mean, they should have responded to what Hamas did. That was horrific and beyond belief. But my feeling about that is now, okay, they've responded. They've killed about 100,000 or 200,000 more than Hamas did. Ain't that enough? I mean, can't they say now they've avenged those people? So I don't know. I think it has to stop. But that's only one thing. There's all the stuff with Putin and this one in the Ukraine. I mean, just it makes you believe that the world is headed towards, its end almost. But I don't believe that, because in my life, people have shown me over and over again, if given a chance, they will be good and they will help you. And most people, even if they are jealous of your talent or something like that, they'll still help you. My friend Marty Bell was an editor at New Times. I didn't even know the guy. He was so for me. He helped me so much. And he would call me up and say, "I got another assignment for you. You have to do a piece on Larry Flint." And I'd say, "Okay." Are you kidding? I couldn't wait. And I said, "And by the way, who is Larry Flint? I never heard of the
guy." Good.
So
Good.
they said, "You just got to fly out to Ohio," where he lived then, and just hang out with him for a while. But we'll send you some hustlers to show you what he's like. And then when they sent me those hustlers, I was, holy God.
Okay, Bob, we have to, for our viewers and listeners, last thing, we need to hear the story about Hill Street.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd gotten a new agent. Jay and I had a parting of the ways, Jay Acton, but he did get Red Baker published finally, so I got to give him that. But for other reasons, we just decided to break up, and we were still good friends. Anyway, I went with Esther Newberg at ICM, and she called me one day and said, well, what do you want to do next? And I said, next? I said, win the lottery. You know, I'm going to buy a scratch-off card. Anyway, she said, I'm serious. And she said, how would you like to work on Hill Street Blues? I said, yeah, and I also like to play center field for the Baltimore Orioles, but it's not going to happen. And she said, listen, it might. I have a meeting tonight at the Lanes with David Milch and Jeff Lewis, who are running the show now. Botch Goes Left. And they need a guy who's good at street stuff and knows all that. And I said, I'm the guy. And she said, I thought so. So you want to do it? I said, yeah, I want to do it. What do we got to do? And she said, well, by that time, I'd written a script of Hill Street. I mean, not of Hill Street, of Red Baker with Stuart Margolin. If you remember Stuart, he played on the Rockford Files.
Yeah. He's Rockford's partner.
Yeah, he played Angel.
Angel, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, the con man that always says things like, don't worry, Jimmy, when we get in that alley, I'll be backing you up. And then, of course, Jim would turn around. Nobody would be there. So he was a wonderful, wonderful guy. He loved the book. We wrote the script. He wanted to direct it. That was the problem. And nobody wanted him to direct it because he was not in that class, yet. And he was still a good director, though. He took it to Clint Eastwood. Clint liked it, but he said, I want to direct it. Stuart wouldn't let him do it. So, that's the way it went. So then she sent it to Milch and Lewis and for television. Well, I didn't really want to do television. The only television show I really wanted to do was Hill Street Blues, because that's the only one I really liked a lot. I liked two shows. I liked it and Miami Vice. And the weird thing is I ended up working on both of them. But anyway, she said, okay, you got to call him up and talk to him tomorrow. So I called them, and they both were in the office, and they said, hey, Bob, it's great. We read your script. We really think it's terrific. We would like to hire you, but you've got to come up with some ideas. Do you have any ideas for a good hour show? One show. And I said, ideas? I've got so many ideas. They're warring in my head. I can't tell you any of them right now. And Milch started laughing at me. He said, well, if one of them becomes clear, like in a crystal ball, he always talk like this, He said, make sure that you call us tomorrow, okay? So now I'm hanging up. I'm panicking, like, I have no ideas. Zero, which they knew. So I called over to Baltimore Homicide. Now I'm living in D.C. with Celeste, but for some reason I didn't call the D.C. police. I called Baltimore police because I still feel like a Baltimore guy. So I called them up. I called the homicide division. They said, yes. And I said, well, I'm Robert Ward, and I have the chance to do this show, Hill Street Blues. They said, oh, we love that show. That's the only cop show we really like. I said, great. That's what I need. I need an idea that will get me a job there. And they, oh, you might get a job there. I said, yeah, but I don't have any ideas. Can you help me? He said, yeah, we got a guy here that'll help. You just come over and I'll introduce you to him. So I said, okay. So I drove over. I parked the car out in front of the cop headquarters. I went in and went to homicide. And this guy says, okay, I wanted to introduce you to the guy who's going to help you. So this big dude comes out. You know how cops are these wide guys. They have these wide, tough looks, And this guy had all that. He looked like somebody who one punch would kill you. And he said, he was really friendly, though. He said, hi, I'm Robert Ward. And I said, what? He said, I'm Robert Ward, homicide. He showed me his badge. And I said,
wow.
Oh, I'm Robert Ward. I said, I'm Robert Ward, the writer. Now, if you don't believe it,
wow, that's wild.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So now he said, okay, now here's what we do. We're going to go to this cop bar and we're going to drink and come up with ideas. But you got to pay for it, okay? I said, let's go. I'm ready. So we went over there and we had like 3 or 4 whiskeys, 3 or 4 beers back. And we got just absolutely stinko drunk. And he told me this first idea that came into his head because it had just happened. And you don't want me to tell you the whole idea now, do you? Or do you? What do you think?
The idea?
Yeah.
Sure, go for it.
All right. His idea was, and it was an idea based totally on what happened. He had a friend who was a homicide cop, And he fell in love with this girl who was formerly going out with a homicide cop, another one. Well, she was she was divorced from that guy. So now she really wanted another husband because she had a kid, 6-year-old kid. Now they're all black in the story. Everybody's black. The cop, her, and the kid. So he starts taking her out, and she's great in bed, and she loves him, and she is just madly in love with him. And they've only gone out a couple of weeks, and she says, "I want you to come tonight to meet my parents." And he thought, "Oh God, I know what that is. Meeting the parents." Oh my God. So he tells one of his friends, he says, "I got to meet the parents. You know what that means? She wants me to marry her." The guy says, "Duh, she has a child." It's like, so he says, "I know, I just never thought about it." He says, I don't know what to do." He says, "Well, call her and tell you can't come tonight. You have to work." He says, "Right." But he couldn't do it. So instead he does nothing, which is probably the worst choice ever. She goes over to her parents' house. He doesn't show up. So she's completely humiliated. Her parents don't think any much of him. She goes home. So now he calls her the next day and says, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sorry." She says, "Well, come over and see me and we'll talk about it." So he goes to see her, and he knows he's got to tell her right away before they get in bed. Because if they get in bed, he won't tell her. So they go over there and she starts kissing and hugging him. And the next thing you know, they're in bed. And they have a great sex in bed. Now he's starting to weaken again. He finally says it. "I can't do it. We got to break up because I don't want to get married yet." And she said, "And you came over here, had sex with me, and you knew it all along? Why, you son of a bitch." And she starts throwing stuff at him. She is furious. Now the kid is outside. He hears all this. He was used to his other father, his real father, beating him up and beating her up. So he freaks out. He goes in, and the cop has left his gun sitting in his holster on a chair while he was in bed. The kid goes over, takes the gun out of the holster, shoots the cop in the back 4 times to save his mother, and then runs out of the house and disappears. And they have to find him and bring him back. And the guy died the guy in the real story died out on the front of the house as he was trying to call the police. So it's a real tragedy, you know? But I've never seen that story before on any.
That's interesting.
I'd never seen anything like that story in all the cop shows I'd ever watched.
Huh.
So I just said, "That's the greatest story I've ever heard. That will sell." They told me I had to come up with a strong story. And I know who can star in it. It was Tarian Block. Do you remember Tarian? He was one of the black cops in it, and he was wonderful. And so I went back, and I had he told me a couple other things that were pretty good too. So I went back to California, and I sat down with him at lunch. Man, I was a tense lunch. And I told him that story I just told you. And after it was over, there was one other cutoff period. They said, "Okay, well, that's the greatest story we ever heard. And if you can write it, you're hired." And I said, "Hired? Hired?" It's like a member of the staff. He said, "Yeah, you have to move here." I said, "Oh, right, move here." I was like a total innocent about television. I knew nothing about how shows were made or anything. So I went back to Washington, and I wrote the script. And I was used to the incredibly slow process of getting your book read, published, and all that. It would be months before anything happened. If it was already accepted, it would still take months for them to edit it and all that. So I thought, I'm not going to hear from these people for a month probably. I heard back the next day. Milch called me up and said, "This is an awesome story." He said, "This is the best script we've ever had by a guy who wasn't on the staff." He said, and plus all your other little stories in it are great too. We just have to fix a couple little things. And it was just a couple of things. And he said, well, you're hired. So that's how I got the job. And I said, well, when do you want me there? He said, well, you're paid by the week, Bob. So it's Monday. You better be here by Wednesday. I said, oh my God, you've already started the year. And he said, well, yeah, if you don't get here by Wednesday, you won't get paid for this week. I said, okay, I'll be there. So I called my girlfriend. She was running all the stuff at NPR at the time. And she would get frantic around 5 o'clock because it's close to time to be on the radio. But I didn't even know what time it was. I was so happy. So I called her up and I said, hi. And she said, I can't talk. I'm on deadline. I said, listen, forget deadline. We're moving to Hollywood. And she said, what? And I said, I got that job on Hill Street Blues. And she screamed out, Bob got that job on Hill Street Blues. And I could hear everybody at NPR screaming, yay, hooray, it's wonderful. And it was probably the most important day of my life because I don't know if I could have gone on much longer making $10,000 advances, and writing books that were hard for people to sell. So anyway, I probably will still do it anyway. And anyhow, I have done it since then. I've written books that were complex and interesting. Four Kinds of Rain's one of my favorites, but that's another story. So
you tell American stories, and your story is an American story, and the people that you have come across in your travels are American stories unto themselves. Amy and I thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today.
Well, thank you.
I hope you come back.
Yeah, Bob, thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys. And I would love to come back. I've got many stories about Hollywood since I've been here, which are really just as crazy.
We're looking forward to that.
All right. See you
Thank
soon.
you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Bob.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
It's only Chinatown.
It's only Chinatown. That's it. That's right. And it really is, too. I'll see you later.
Well, that pretty much sums it up because Bob is full of stories, full of every kind of story. And I want to listen to more. So let's have him back on Believe in People because he believes in people. He writes about them.
And people believe in him. So the whole thing is if you're feeling, and he had great stories about, being sort of frustrated and not continuing with certain things or, moving into something else. Hey, he just kept going. So if you're feeling, sort of like a little hopeless or helpless, then just be reminded that if you just keep pushing, be surprised at what can transpire. And thank you so much for listening today. And if you believe in us, subscribe to Believe in People. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.